everyone, and welcome to week 3. I hope you're enjoying the class so far. And as you know, this week we're looking at quilts, we're looking at community cookbooks, we're looking at journals, so we're looking at things that women leave behind. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about community cookbooks, and specifically I wanted to kind of give you a sense of why they're important and show you some visuals of why they're important. I think that's so crucial because you may not understand why I think they're important for genealogy if you don't have quite a few of your own to take a look at. So let's do that, and let's talk first as we get started. Let me just kind of give you a little bit of a history. Now, community cookbooks, or what I'm calling community cookbooks, might be also referred to as fundraising cookbooks, charity cookbooks, or maybe you call them church cookbooks. And whatever name that you want to ascribe to them, they all have the same thing in common. These are compiled cookbooks where various cooks provide recipes in different categories, and depending on who's putting the cookbook together, it may include genealogically relevant information besides just a name. Now, sometimes these cookbooks are known by a group name, and probably one of the more familiar ones is the Junior League Cookbook. In fact, some cookbook collectors just collect those. The first community cookbook is about the Civil War era. It's 1864, and it was called a poetical cookbook. And that was a cookbook that was put together to raise money for helping Union soldiers. Now, obviously, when we look at what women can do to raise funds, they are going to do things that they're good at, or that they have lots of practice at, especially during this time period. And so we're looking at quilts and cookbooks. Now, by the early 1920s, they estimate that there were approximately 3,000 to 6,000 community cookbooks that have been published. Now, why is that an approximate? Well, as you probably know, these cookbooks tend to be ephemeral in quality, meaning that people tend to throw them away. They're not seen as something that are archivable. Sometimes people have not thought much of them. In fact, one of the comments I always get when I'm trying to purchase some at a Friends of the Library book sale is, have you read these? They don't have very good recipes. So people tend to see them as something that you throw away, that maybe you purchase to help somebody raise, funds, and maybe you use a few of the recipes, but that's it. Now, who were they created by? And this is where one of the reasons I keep saying know what your ancestor was a part of, because these are created for all kinds of organizations, including schools, churches, membership organizations, benevolent groups, fraternal organizations, service groups, political groups, causes, and occupational groups. And we'll see some of that as we continue on. But it's important to keep in mind that all sorts of groups put these together. And I probably should also say that although the main focus is typically fundraising, it's not always. Sometimes I've seen some of these cookbooks that were just compiled to compile them, and they were not sold. So that's important to keep in mind as well. And there are family community type cookbooks where family members contributed, their name is in there, and obviously those weren't for sale, or if they were just to the family group. Now, sometimes you can see mentions of these cookbooks in the newspaper, and we've talked about newspapers in week 1. One of the causes that had women creating cookbooks was suffrage, and so that's what this is referring to in 1909. And of course, there was a lot of joking about whether suffragists actually knew how to cook. So, in fact, it's talking about that here. It says the favorite argument of the antis, and that's the anti-suffrage people, that suffrage is likely to masculinize women, and that the suffragists are not domestic-loving creatures. So, quite a few suffrage groups actually put together cookbooks. So these included just local groups, but also nationwide, and included some big names. Here's an example, the Washington Women's Cookbook, which was a suffrage cookbook. This is on a website called Feeding America, and you can use this website to look up old cookbooks, not just community cookbooks. In fact, they have the first cookbook that was written by an American woman. Her name was Amelia Simmons, and that is here as well. This is the Michigan State University, and what they've done is they've digitized some of their cookbook collection and made them available on here. So it's not just the suffrage cookbook, it's quite a few. Let's talk a little bit about specifics and some of the things that you could see in a community cookbook. And I'm showing this picture. This is some of mine. I have many, but these are a few. And I did this just to show you how varied they are. The first one is a congressional one, and then there's another one by Junior League, and I think actually that third one is Junior League, and then there's one with Goodwill Industries, and then the last one is actually, oh gosh, I think it's a Japanese cookbook, but it's Americans Living in Japan. So here's an example of one cookbook. This is an early one. This is 1876, and it's called 76, a cookbook, The Ladies of Plymouth Church, Des Moines, Iowa. And you can see on the right are some of the recipes. In fact, this is a page of recipes for the sick, because these cookbooks often included not only just recipes, but recipes for house cleaning and for taking care of sick family members. And as you can see, 3 of these are for wine jelly. So if the wine doesn't do it, you may not care that you're sick, right? And then there's also toast water, which is less exciting than the wine jelly. But in this example, you can see that there's very little personal information. It's just Mrs. P.H. Carpenter or Mrs. J. Carpenter, so it's just initials. The top one gives us a place because she's not in Iowa, but otherwise it's very slim with the information in this example. And that's fairly true for those early cookbooks. Now, here's another one. This is from Illinois, and this is from 1948 from the Donor Club. So this is kind of a benevolent group. And one of the features of some community cookbooks is the members of that group. And you can see it's not only those who are on the board, but it's also the everyday members. And you will also notice that it is Mrs. whatever his name is, right? So that's another good reminder to us that we need to not only look for information based on her name, but also the husband's name. Now, I should probably point out one more thing. If you look down this list of names, let's say just the left-hand side, for example, about halfway through you see Mrs. Mildred Hoban. So it's not her husband's name. That could indicate she's a widow. I'm not saying for certain that is. I haven't researched her, but that might be why it's that. So then you would want to research and see if he's deceased. Here's another suffrage cookbook, and this one is from Pittsburgh, and it gives the list of contributors because in this case they're contributors from across the nation, and some of them are extremely important. So you can see it gives the contributor and where they're from. Now, community cookbooks, I always tell people that they are a city directory of women, because what do city directories have? They have names, addresses, and they have advertising, and this is a good example. Advertisements appeared in community cookbooks because that would help pay for printing and other costs, publishing costs, and that would help them make more money. And you can see all kinds of ads in community cookbooks. This one is for a funeral director, and if you think, oh, this is from a 19th century community cookbook, but I obtained one the other day from the 1980s, and the first ad was a funeral director. So It's all kinds of different ads that you can find in there, not necessarily all food related. Now here's a food related one, and this is great because it's for a meat market, and you can see the carcasses over there on the right, and the men sitting around waiting for somebody to come in and order some meat. Now, I should also point out, it gave the name of the proprietor. Now, if that was your ancestor, that's a fabulous find. Now, churches did all kinds of community cookbooks, and that's one of the reasons why I keep pushing this, is you just never know what you're going to find. Now, this is kind of a combination cookbook and history. This is called Historic Paxton, Her Days and Her Ways, 1722 to 1913. And it says family recipes, but actually the whole front half of the book is a history. It's only the back half that's recipes. But why I love this so much is there's even a chapter about the graveyard. And, I mean, there's information about people in the graveyard. There's photos of the graveyard. There's a history of the graveyard. It's fabulous. So that's a cookbook. Who knew that you could find cemetery information in a cookbook? But you can. So that's another reason why they're so valuable. Sometimes information about familial relationships will come up in a cookbook. Now this is one, it's a VIP cookbook, and it features recipes from people in the White House, Capitol Hill, media personalities, and area hostesses. And you can see that this one is from a senator's wife. Her name is there at the bottom. He's the senator from Nebraska. And she says this is his favorite recipe. His mother used to please her 11 children. So there we not only have that he's one of 11, but that his mom used to make it. So this is a great addition to this recipe, and that's not unusual. Sometimes you'll see recipes that say Grandma Smith's cookies, or Aunt Helen's this, or, you know, a little explanation. And so that's the other thing that is genealogically relevant in these cookbooks. Now, sometimes these cookbooks do include contributors from all over the world, and one of my favorite sets, I have a few of the books in the set, is these favorite recipes of America. Now, they don't look like what we often think of as community cookbooks. They kind of, this is exactly what they look like. They have a big photo on the front. They're hardback, and they typically are, the contributors are people like home ec teachers. In fact, that last recipe you can see, Polly Powell, home economics teacher, Ojai, California. And this is all over. I mean, look, the second recipe is a woman from Alberta, Canada. So these are great books with lots of women in it, not necessarily all living in the same place. So that makes it a little more of a challenge to find your ancestor. But there's quite a few different kinds of sets that were for home ec teachers. So if you did have somebody who was doing that, you might find them in those. Now, I've shown you some community cookbooks, and so what I want to ask you is this question. What makes a source have genealogical or family history value? Well, it has names, right? That's probably the first thing you think of. It gives a place, whether that's the individual's location, their residence, or an overall location, like a city. It provides a date, so we know what time period this is. And sometimes it's a relationship, you know, married couples or children or stuff like that. Those are things in community cookbooks. Now, are they all consistently like that? No, of course not. But that's what makes them so wonderful, is because they do contain that kind of information. I mean, when you think about a census or even a city directory, what makes them important? Well, it's that name, that connection to a date and a place. That's the same as what's in a community cookbook, except for the most part, it's just women. I mean, look at this example. This is Woman's Glory, the Kitchen, and it's from the Slovenian Women's Union of America. This is a great cookbook. And you can see there the first recipe has not only the woman's name, and she's vice president of this group, it has her street address. How do you get more city directory-ish than that? And like I said before, these directories, we've had them since the time of the Civil War. They have all kinds of looks. They concentrate on all kinds of things. This one is from the Lutheran Ladies' Aid from Fisher, Minnesota. And in there are hot dishes. That's a fairly common thing for Midwestern folk. And what's interesting is, this is from Minnesota, but that first dish is from a woman in, it is Minnesota. I'm sorry about that. From Minnesota, but it gives you specifically what city because it's different than Fisher. And then that's true also for the third recipe. So it gives us some information. Now, you can get other information by what they provide, not so much this information here on this page, but when you get ethnic recipes, for example, that might give you some sense of background, for example, or recipes that weren't typically used in that place during that time. And then there's ads. Here's all the ads, or some of them, for this cookbook, and you can see there's some addresses, there's some names of people. So what a wonderful find. Now, studying cookbooks isn't something that I came up with. There's all kinds of people who study cookbooks and food history. This is a book I often recommend. It's called Eat My Words, Reading Women's Lives Through the Cookbooks They Wrote. And in this cookbook, she talks a lot about that cookbooks are part of a community, and they provide community history. They're part of collective memory. They provide lineage and legacies, and they are autobiographies as well. So not all of them, but some of them. And not only just community cookbooks, but also what we call manuscript cookbooks, where the women went ahead and created their own cookbooks. So, when we think about researching women, it's important to research them in the context of things that they left behind. One of the things the author says in the book is, most women have been included in the written record only if they were engaged in civic affairs or linked with famous men. In addition, while accounts of significant public events were recorded in newspapers, journals, diaries, manuscripts, biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs, information about common folk, particularly women, is more difficult to find. So she makes this statement because that goes back to researching women based on what they left behind. Okay, so I've given you my case for community cookbooks. Let me talk a little bit about how to find them and before we close up. So where are they? Well, obviously they can be in repositories. They can be in home sources as well. I've had people who have come across community cookbooks in their parents' houses or their house that include their family members. But let's talk a little bit about where they are in other places. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about what community cookbooks exist for a different place, there is a book by Margaret Cook called America's Charitable Cooks, a bibliography of fundraising cookbooks published in the U.S. It goes up to 1915. There's about 3,000 entries, and so it's not complete, but it's one way that you can look for different titles for different places. Now, we talked about in week 2 about digitized books, and that's one of the places that you could find these cookbooks. This is a page off of Hattie Trust, which we went over previously. This is a 1917 cookbook, the Third Presbyterian Cookbook and Household Directory. And as you can see, it's from Pennsylvania, from the Presbyterian Church. And so you can go through there and see that cookbook. Now, Internet Archive, which we also discussed, actually has a cookbook collection. Now, the way you get to it is by clicking on the orange book and going to the texts, and then clicking on that additional collections. I think you might remember that from the genealogy collection that's in there. So you can go in there, and they actually have a cookbook collection. And in there they have all kinds of cookbooks, not just community cookbooks, but others as well. And obviously you could just do a search on American libraries or Canadian libraries in addition to that. And then of course there's Google Books. So in fact, some of those cookbooks on HathiTrust are actually from Google Books. And the nice thing about Google Books is you can put in a term, and if you get too many results, you can narrow it by century or specific date range. Now, you've probably heard me talk about this before, but just real quickly, community cookbooks can be found in libraries, obviously, and there's different kinds of libraries. There's public libraries, which you probably go to one near your house quite a bit. There's private libraries, there's academic libraries, and just because it's an academic library doesn't mean that they don't have community cookbooks, so keep that in mind. There's state libraries, national libraries, like let's say Library of Congress, there's a USDA library, and then there's genealogical libraries. Even Family Search has some community cookbooks. So it's always something that you can search for, wherever you plan on going. And you can find these in WorldCat. I would probably search for the words cookbook and then whatever city or church your ancestor was from, and see if you can find it that way. You can also find it in like that book that I told you about that lists community cookbooks up to 1915. So there's other ways to do it as well, but WorldCat might be your best bet if you're going to a specific library. And then obviously their own library catalog would be important. Now, here's just a general search I did on the words Methodist cookbook, and I received 3,000 results. Now, I did not narrow this down by place, but that could be my next step. And I just want to let you see what it looks like. There's 3 of the hits. So, for example, that middle one, Bentley United Methodist Cookbook, that's from Kansas, and it says it's 2001. So these aren't just going to be older cookbooks, they're also going to be newer ones. And just like there's different kinds of libraries, there's different kinds of archives, and not all archives are going to have cookbooks, so that's probably pretty obvious. But you know what? I have seen a cookbook from NARA, actually. It had to do with a federal government occupation, and they did a community cookbook. I don't think it was to raise funds, it was just kind of to do it. There's also academic libraries that are academic archives that would have cookbooks. There's historical society archives that should have cookbooks, museums, religious archives. So there's other archives that they may have that. Now, if you approach them and say, do you have cookbooks? They might say no. So that's why you should always check the catalog. Now, one catalog you should use for archives is Archive Grid, and this, just like WorldCat, is worldwide. So what you do is at the top right in that search box, you put in the place your ancestor was from, or you could put in a religion, or you could put in the place and the word cookbook. So you could try a few different things. Now, obviously, not everybody participates in Archive Grid, so it may not have the archive near where your ancestor is from, but you can, there in the middle, look and see if that archive participates. So I just did a general search on community cookbooks. Now, obviously, not everybody is going to say community cookbook. They may say fundraising or church or just cookbook. So you need to keep that in mind. There was only 400 results, and as you can see, that's a general search, so I would really need to narrow that down by maybe place. But it lists what it is, where it's located, how big is the collection. You can see that top one says 32 volumes or 3 archive boxes, and it says it's ethnic and local interest cookbooks. So you can click on Read More to find out more about that collection and how to access it. Now, eBay is also a great place, and this actually, when I'm looking for specific cookbooks for either a church or a place, this is where I go to. So in this instance, I did California Community Cookbook and got 143 listings. And obviously, you can sort this however you would like. It right now is sorting as best match, but you can also sort it by a price as well and a few other things. And you can see these really run the range of what people are asking for price-wise. And there's other places to find cookbooks, including websites that sell cookbooks or even books. Abe Books is one such example. It sells vintage books, and so that's a good place to look. This Omnivore Books is a bookstore here in California, and they specialize in cookbooks. And so that's a place that you can go, and I think some of their books might even be on eBay. So it just matters what you're looking for. Obviously, if you're just trying to scout out what might have your ancestry, you might be best off looking in WorldCat and checking out the collection of local libraries. Now, lots of people write about community cookbooks, and obviously I do. Here is my blog, Food, Family, Ephemera, and you can go on there and see some of the things I've posted about community cookbooks and also food and family history. All right, so I just wanted to give you kind of a taste, pun intended there, of using community cookbooks and give you some ideas, and I hope that maybe you'll try to incorporate those into your own family history. I'll see you next week.